We've agreed you're no longer part of the family. I read the words for the third time, my coffee going cold in my hand, morning light streaming through my San Francisco apartment windows in a way that felt suddenly too bright, too cheerful for what I was holding. The text message from my mother had arrived at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, and I'd opened it expecting the usual brief check-in, or perhaps a forwarded chain message about some health scare she'd read on Facebook. But instead, I got 5 paragraphs that felt like a carefully composed eviction notice from the only family I'd ever known. My hand started shaking somewhere around the second paragraph, the one where she listed my failures as a sister. And by the time I reached the part about not attending Jennifer's engagement party or any future family gatherings, I had to set my phone down on the kitchen counter because I couldn't hold it steady anymore. I'm 28 years old, a senior engineering manager at a major tech company, living in a city 2,843 miles from my childhood home in Connecticut. And until that Tuesday morning, I had believed that despite everything, despite the years of feeling invisible, and the countless small dismissals, and the way my accomplishments seemed to evaporate the moment I shared them, I still had a family. I still belonged somewhere. The message didn't come completely without warning, though at the time I thought things were just tense, just awkward the way they'd always been awkward when I visited home, when I tried to find my place in conversations that seemed to flow perfectly well until I opened my mouth. 3 weeks earlier, I'd flown back to Connecticut for a family dinner, one of those mandatory Sunday gatherings at my parents' house in Westport, where my mother cooked pot roast and my father presided over the table like a benevolent king holding court, and where my older sister Jennifer had announced her engagement to Brandon Whitmore, whose last name came with the kind of old money that had its own Wikipedia page. I had been genuinely happy for her, truly pleased to see her glowing with joy as she showed us the ring, a stunning emerald-cut diamond that caught the light from the chandelier like it was performing for us. And I'd hugged her and congratulated her with real warmth, because despite everything between us, despite the lifetime of being compared to her and coming up short, she was still my sister. But then, in what I thought was a natural lull in the celebration, I'd mentioned my own recent news, the promotion I'd received just 2 weeks earlier, and my mother had turned to me with that particular expression I'd learned to recognize over 28 years, the one that mixed disappointment with exhaustion, and said, "Not everything is about you, Sarah." Those 7 words, delivered in front of everyone, with my father not even looking up from his phone, and Jennifer rolling her eyes in that way she'd perfected in high school. Now, standing in my kitchen with my mother's message glowing on my phone screen, I understood that dinner hadn't been just another awkward family gathering. It had been my final test, and apparently, I had failed. The pattern started so early I can barely remember a time when it wasn't there, woven into the fabric of every family moment, like a thread I couldn't see but could always feel pulling tight around me. Jennifer is 3 years older, and from my earliest memories, she was the sun around which our family orbited, the golden child whose accomplishments were celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm that made me believe, even as a small child, that achievement itself had different values depending on who achieved it. When Jennifer graduated high school as valedictorian, my parents threw a party for 60 people in our backyard, complete with a catered dinner and a slideshow of her accomplishments projected on a screen they'd rented specifically for the occasion. And I remember my father's speech that night, how his voice cracked with pride when he talked about his brilliant daughter who was headed to Princeton on a partial scholarship that he and my mother were honored to supplement with the remainder of the tuition. 3 years later, when I graduated, also as valedictorian from the same high school, we went to dinner at Olive Garden with just the 4 of us, and my father spent most of the meal on his phone, while my mother talked about how Jennifer was interviewing for positions at prestigious law firms. The college situation crystallized everything I'd been feeling, but hadn't known how to name. Jennifer's Princeton education cost my parents $43,000 per year after her scholarship, and they paid every cent without hesitation, visited her regularly, attended her activities, displayed Princeton merchandise in our home like we were all alumni. When it was my turn, I was told that times were harder now, that my father's business had some slow years, that I should consider the state university where tuition was significantly lower. And when I asked about applying to schools like MIT or Stanford, where I might have had a chance with my grades and test scores, my mother said that those schools were too far away and too focused on academics at the expense of social development, which felt like code for something I couldn't quite translate, but understood meant I shouldn't reach that high. I took out $47,000 in student loans to attend UConn, worked 25 hours a week throughout college at the campus library and then at a coffee shop, and graduated with a degree in computer science and a job offer in California that paid $65,000 a year, which felt like a fortune to me, but which my father called a decent starting salary, I suppose, when I told him over the phone. I moved to San Francisco 6 years ago, driving across the country in my used Honda Civic with everything I owned packed into the back seat and trunk, and I called my parents when I arrived to tell them I'd made it safely, that my apartment was small but in a good neighborhood, that I was excited and terrified and hopeful about this new chapter. My mother listened politely and then said, "Well, Jennifer's making partner track at her firm. Can you believe it? Only 3 years out of law school." And I sat in my empty apartment that night on an air mattress that wouldn't arrive until the next day, eating takeout Thai food alone, wondering what I would have to accomplish before I became the daughter worth celebrating. What I didn't tell my family during those 6 years in San Francisco was that I had built something remarkable from that $65,000 starting salary, and that studio apartment, and those student loans that hung around my neck like weights I carried everywhere. My first year at DataStream Solutions was brutal in the way that only entry-level tech positions can be. Endless hours debugging code and sitting in meetings where senior engineers talked over me and being assigned the projects nobody else wanted. But I showed up every single day at 7 in the morning, and I stayed until the work was finished, and I learned everything I could from everyone who would teach me. After 18 months, I was promoted to Software Engineer 2 with a salary increase to $82,000, and I called my mother to share the news, excited about the $30,000 raise that felt like validation of all those hours. And she said, "That's nice, honey, but Jennifer just argued a case in front of the state Supreme Court. Can you imagine?" And I stopped calling home with career updates after that. The promotions kept coming because I was good at what I did, better than good, actually. I had a way of seeing problems in code that other engineers missed, and I could translate complex technical concepts to non-technical stakeholders in a way that made me invaluable during client presentations. And by year 3, I was a senior software engineer making $135,000 with stock options that were starting to actually mean something as the company grew. I led a small team on a project that revolutionized how our main product handled data encryption, work that ended up saving our largest client $17 million in potential security breach costs, and my manager nominated me for the company's Innovation Award, which I won, which came with a $20,000 bonus that I used to pay off the last of my student loans at age 26. Year 4 brought another promotion to engineering team lead, salary of $185,000, managing 12 engineers and overseeing 3 major product features. And I was working 60-hour weeks and loving most of it. The challenge and the complexity, and the way my team trusted me to advocate for them and shield them from corporate politics they didn't want to navigate. When I went home for Christmas that year, my father asked what I was doing for work, and I gave him the short version, team lead at a tech company, managing engineers, and he nodded and said, "So you're like a supervisor?" And then turned to Jennifer to ask about her latest case. The promotion to senior engineering manager came 5 months ago with a base salary of $240,000, and it came because I'd spent the previous 8 months leading the development of a new product feature that integrated artificial intelligence into our core platform in a way that none of our competitors had managed. And within 3 months of launch, we'd signed 15 new enterprise clients worth a combined $43 million in contracts. My stock options, which I'd been accumulating since year 2, were now worth approximately $412,000 based on the company's latest valuation, and I had a benefits package that included full health coverage, an unlimited PTO, and a professional development budget of $15,000 per year. I was 28 years old, debt-free, financially secure in ways I'd never imagined when I was shelving books in the Yukon Library for $9 an hour. And the only people who knew the full scope of what I'd built were my colleagues and my best friend Maya, and my mentor Dr. Patricia Chen, because I had learned that my family didn't want to hear about my success. They wanted me to stay small and grateful and perpetually reaching for an approval they would never give. The dinner 3 weeks before the letter arrived was at my parents' house in Connecticut, one of those obligatory family gatherings I'd flown across the country to attend, because Jennifer had said she had big news to share, and my mother had specifically called to say my presence was expected. I'd arrived on a Thursday evening after taking a red-eye flight that landed at 6 in the morning and going straight to my hotel, because staying at my parents' house always felt like sleeping in a museum of Jennifer's achievements. Her framed degrees and awards covering walls, while my college graduation photo sat on a shelf in the basement. Jennifer was already there when I walked in at 7, looking perfect in the effortless way she always managed, her hair blown out and her engagement ring catching the light before she'd even made the announcement. And I knew immediately what the big news would be, but I was genuinely happy for her because despite everything, I'd never wished unhappiness on my sister. We sat down to dinner, and my mother had gone all out with the expensive dishes and the good wine, and a standing rib roast that probably cost $150. And Jennifer was glowing in a way I'd never seen before. And when she stood up holding Brandon's hand and announced they were engaged, I clapped and smiled and said, "Congratulations! That's wonderful." And I meant it with my whole heart. Brandon seemed like a good person from the few times I'd met him, successful and kind and clearly devoted to Jennifer, and she deserved happiness, even if our family dynamics were broken. The conversation flowed around wedding plans and venue ideas, and my mother was already talking about guest lists and dress shopping, and there was a lull in the conversation after about 20 minutes, and I thought maybe this was a moment when I could share something too, when I could be part of the family celebration instead of just an audience member. So I said, "I actually have some good news too. I just got promoted to senior engineering manager at my company." And I hadn't even finished the sentence before my mother cut me off with, "Not everything is about you, Sarah," in that tone she used when she was disappointed in me for some breach of etiquette I hadn't known I was committing. I felt my face get hot, and I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to make it about me, I was just sharing. But my father didn't even look up from his phone where he was typing something. And Jennifer rolled her eyes and said, "Still doing that computer thing?" Like my career was a hobby I should have outgrown. Like the 6 years I'd spent building expertise and leading teams and creating value was equivalent to collecting stamps or playing video games in my parents' basement. I sat there for another 45 minutes, picking at my food while they discussed wedding plans. And I felt invisible in the way I'd felt invisible my entire childhood. And finally, I said I wasn't feeling well and needed to get back to my hotel. And my mother barely looked at me when she said goodbye, and I drove back to the hotel with tears streaming down my face and my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and I sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes before I could go inside because I didn't want anyone to see me crying in the lobby. The letter arrived 5 days after that dinner, arriving in my email inbox with the subject line "Family Discussion," like it was going to be about Thanksgiving plans or who was bringing what dish to a potluck. And I opened it on a Tuesday morning before work while I was drinking coffee in my apartment that overlooked the bay, and the first line made me set the cup down so hard that coffee sloshed onto my desk. "Dear Sarah, after much discussion, your father, Jennifer, and I have agreed that you're no longer part of this family." And I had to read that sentence 3 times before my brain would accept what my eyes were seeing, and the letter continued in my mother's voice that I could hear in my head as I read, that particular tone she used when she was disappointed in me but pretending to be reasonable about it. She wrote that my behavior at Jennifer's engagement dinner had been unacceptable and narcissistic, and that my attempt to steal the spotlight from my sister during her special moment showed a pattern of jealousy and negativity that had been present my whole life, and I felt something crack inside my chest as I read her interpretation of events that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. The letter said that I was uninvited from the engagement party and all future family gatherings until you can learn to be happy for your sister and stop making everything about yourself, and that they had tried for years to include you and support you, but you've made it clear through your attitude that you don't value this family. And I started laughing at that line, actually laughing out loud in my empty apartment. Because the absurdity of being accused of not valuing a family that had dismissed me at every turn was almost too much to process. My mother wrote that Jennifer was heartbroken by my behavior and that I owed her an apology, and that my father agreed that some distance would be best for everyone, and that they hoped I would use this time to reflect on your actions and your priorities, as if I were a teenager being grounded rather than a 28-year-old woman who had just been excommunicated from her own family via email. The letter ended with, "We love you, but we can't have this negativity around Jennifer during this happy time in her life." And it was signed Mom, with no acknowledgement from my father or sister directly, just my mother speaking for the family collective that had apparently voted me off the island. I read the entire letter 4 times, sitting at my desk, and then I read it again on my phone while I sat on my couch, and each time I searched for some hint of self-awareness or irony or recognition that maybe, possibly, their version of events was skewed, but there was nothing, just absolute certainty that I was the problem and they were the victims of my selfishness. I realized as the sun moved across my apartment and my coffee grew cold that this was it. This was the final dismissal after 28 years of trying to be good enough and smart enough and accomplished enough to matter to them. And something shifted in me as I sat there holding my phone with that letter glowing on the screen. I wasn't going to fight this. I wasn't going to send a desperate email defending myself, or call my mother crying, or beg Jennifer to tell them they'd misunderstood. Because I was done begging for scraps of recognition from people who had decided long ago that I wasn't worth their attention. And I made a decision sitting there in my apartment, with the Bay Bridge visible through my window. I would simply exist and let the truth of my life speak for itself whenever they finally bothered to see it. I forwarded the letter to Maya at 10:30 that morning after I'd finally stopped staring at it, and she called me within 3 minutes, her voice tight with the kind of anger I rarely heard from her, and she said, "I'm coming over right now." And I said, "You have work." And she said, "Fuck work, I'm coming over." And she was at my apartment 40 minutes later with coffee and bagels that I couldn't eat, and a fury in her eyes that made me feel less alone than I'd felt since opening that email. Maya had been my friend since my second year in San Francisco, when we'd met at a Women in Tech meetup and bonded over being the only two people who admitted they sometimes had no idea what they were doing. And over the past 5 years, she'd witnessed enough family dinners and overheard enough phone calls to have developed what she called a comprehensive understanding of your family's bullshit. And she read the letter twice on my couch and then looked at me and said, "You know this is insane, right? You know that everything they're accusing you of is projection." And I nodded, because intellectually I knew that, but emotionally, I still felt like maybe I had done something wrong. We talked for 2 hours in my living room, and Maya kept coming back to the same point, that I needed to tell them about my career and my success and prove them wrong. And I kept resisting because something in me was so tired of trying to prove anything to people who had decided my worth years ago and stuck to that assessment despite all evidence to the contrary. "You're a senior engineering manager at one of the fastest growing companies in the valley," Maya said with her hands gesturing emphatically the way they did when she was passionate about something. "You make $240,000 a year. You have stock options worth over $400,000. You lead a team of 15 people, and they think you're failing at your computer thing." And hearing her lay it out like that made the absurdity even clearer, but it also made me sad in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I told Maya I didn't want to prove anything anymore, and I meant it sitting there on my couch. I was so exhausted from years of trying to be enough for them that the thought of sending them my resume or my LinkedIn profile or articles about my company made me feel hollow, and Maya was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with me. She said, "You don't have to prove anything, but they're going to find out eventually. The world is too small and your success is too visible, and when they do find out, you should be there to see their faces." And I laughed at that, despite everything, because Maya had always been able to make me laugh. That afternoon, I went back to work and tried to focus on the product roadmap review I was leading, but my mind kept drifting. And my mentor, Dr. Telit, Patricia Chen, who had been VP of Engineering before retiring and now consulted part-time, noticed I was distracted during our weekly one-on-one and asked if everything was okay. And I found myself telling her an abbreviated version of the letter, and she listened with the same focused attention she brought to technical problems. And when I finished, she said, "Family can't see us clearly because they're still looking at who we were, not who we are." And that felt true in a way that made my chest ache. 2 months passed after that letter arrived, and I settled into a strange new equilibrium where I had no contact with my family and felt simultaneously liberated and unmoored. And I threw myself into work with the kind of focus that comes from having nowhere else to direct emotional energy. And then, on a Wednesday evening in late July, I opened my personal email and saw Jennifer's name in my inbox with the subject line, "You're invited," complete with exclamation point and confetti emoji, like we were friends who exchanged cheerful messages regularly. The email was a formal engagement party invitation with elegant digital calligraphy announcing the celebration of Jennifer Claire Morrison and Brandon James Chen on Saturday, August 15th at Oakmont Country Club from 6 to 10 in the evening, and it included details about parking and dress code and registry information. And there was a brief personal note at the bottom that said, "Can't wait to see you there," signed with Jennifer's name and a heart emoji. And I stared at my laptop screen in my apartment, feeling like I'd slipped into an alternate dimension where the past 2 months hadn't happened. There was no acknowledgement of the letter, no mention of my banishment from the family, no apology or explanation, or even a casual, "Sorry about that misunderstanding." And I read the invitation 5 times, looking for some indication that Jennifer remembered telling me through our mother that I was no longer part of the family. But there was nothing except bright, cheerful party details and that exclamation point that felt like a slap. I didn't respond to the email, and 3 days later my phone rang at 8 in the morning on Saturday, and it was my mother's number and I almost didn't answer, but some part of me needed to hear what she would say. And when I picked up, her voice was breezy and casual, like we'd talked yesterday, instead of not at all for 2 months. And she said, "Hi, honey. Just checking that you got Jennifer's invitation. We haven't seen your RSVP yet." And I sat down on my couch because the audacity of it took my breath away. I said, "Mom, you sent me a letter saying I wasn't part of the family anymore." And my voice was calm and factual, and she laughed, actually laughed. That light dismissive laugh she used when she thought someone was being overdramatic. And she said, "Oh, Sarah, don't be so dramatic. I never said you couldn't come to the party. I just said we needed some space while emotions were high. Of course you're invited. You're Jennifer's sister." And I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I recognized what was happening. This was gaslighting in its purest form, this rewriting of recent history to make me seem unreasonable. And when I said, "You specifically uninvited me from the engagement party and all future family gatherings," she sighed with exasperation and said, "I think you're misremembering. We were all upset after that dinner, but nobody said you couldn't come to your own sister's engagement party. That would be crazy." And the word crazy hung in the air between us with all its implications about who was being irrational. We talked for 10 more minutes in circles, while she insisted that I had misunderstood, and I held my ground about what the letter had actually said. And finally she switched tactics and her voice got tight and she said, "Well, I don't know why you're trying to make this difficult. Jennifer wants you there, and it would break her heart if you didn't come. But if you want to hold a grudge over a misunderstanding, then I guess that's your choice. And I realized as we hung up that they expected me to pretend, to show up and diminish myself, and play the role of lesser daughter at my sister's celebration, and act like nothing had happened. I sat in my apartment for an hour after that call, and something crystallized in me, a clarity that felt like cold water, and I decided I would go to that party, but I would go as myself, fully myself, not the version of me they needed me to make their narrative work. 3 weeks before the engagement party on a Tuesday morning in late July, I was in our executive conference room for the quarterly all-hands meeting when our CEO, Richard Foster, announced that our company had been acquired by Tech Vision Corporation for $870 million, and the room erupted in cheers, and I sat there stunned as he explained that our product development team's work had been the primary asset that made the acquisition attractive, and he specifically named my team's platform as the crown jewel of the deal. The next 48 hours were a blur of meetings with lawyers and finance people, explaining stock option acceleration and vesting schedules and liquidity events. And when the numbers finally came into focus, I understood that my $400,000 in stock options were now immediately worth $1.2 million after taxes. And I sat in my apartment that Wednesday night staring at the number on the paperwork and felt nothing at first because it was too large to feel real. By Thursday, the press releases went out and I started getting LinkedIn messages and emails from former colleagues and recruiters. And on Friday morning, Maya texted me a link to TechCrunch with 3 exclamation points, and when I opened it, there was an article titled 30 Under 30, The Tech Leaders Shaping Tomorrow's Innovation, and my photo was in the header row along with 29 other people I'd only read about in industry publications. And the paragraph about me mentioned my role in the acquisition and quoted Richard, saying I was one of the most talented engineering leaders of her generation, and I read it 5 times, waiting to feel proud, but mostly I felt sad that I couldn't share this with my family without it becoming complicated. Maya called me that afternoon, and she was practically screaming with excitement, and she said, "You have to go to that party now. You have to. This is perfect timing." And I told her I was already planning to go, and she said, "No, I mean you have to go and let them see who you actually are." And I said, "I'm not going to show up and wave the article in their faces." And she said, "You don't have to. The universe is literally doing it for you." And I didn't understand what she meant until the following Monday, when our CEO called me into his office and offered me a promotion to Director of Engineering with a base salary of $340,000 and equity in the new merged company, and I accepted it, sitting in his office feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. That evening, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I went to Nordstrom in the Stanford Shopping Center, and I tried on dresses for an hour, and I bought a midnight blue silk dress that cost $800, which was more than I'd ever spent on a single piece of clothing. And I told myself I wasn't buying it to show off or prove anything to my family, but to feel confident walking into that country club, to feel like I was wearing armor made of silk and self-assurance. And when I looked at myself in the dressing room mirror, I saw someone who looked successful and put together, and I realized that I'd never let my family see this version of me because I'd always been so focused on trying to get them to see my potential that I'd never shown them my actual achievement. I drove to Oakmont Country Club on Saturday evening, August 15th, in my rental car, because I'd flown back to Connecticut the day before and stayed at a hotel rather than with my parents. And as I pulled into the circular driveway at 6:30 and saw the valets in burgundy vests and the elaborate floral arrangements flanking the entrance, I felt my heart hammering so hard I had to sit in the car for 3 full minutes doing the breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. The country club was exactly the kind of place my parents had always aspired to, all white columns and manicured lawns and the subtle wealth that announced itself through understatement. And there were already dozens of cars in the lot, and guests in cocktail attire walking toward the entrance, and I watched them through my windshield, thinking that I could still turn around and drive away, and no one would miss me. But I got out of the car and smoothed down my midnight blue silk dress and walked toward the entrance on heels that cost $200. And the moment I stepped into the marble-floored foyer, I saw my mother holding court with a group of women near the guest book, and her eyes landed on me, and something flickered across her face that might have been surprise or annoyance before she rearranged it into a tight smile and turned back to her conversation without acknowledgement. I signed the guest book with my name in careful script and walked into the main ballroom, which had been transformed with thousands of white roses and gold accents and round tables for 200 guests, and I was scanning the room trying to decide where to position myself when Jennifer appeared at my elbow in a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than my rent, and she said, "Sarah, you came," with a brightness that sounded like performance. And when she hugged me, it was the kind of hug that barely made contact, and she pulled back and looked me up and down and said, "That's a nice dress, very professional, very you." And the compliment had barbs in it that caught on the way down. My father was across the room talking to a man in an expensive suit, and when he saw me, he gave a brief nod, like I was a distant acquaintance, and then immediately returned to his conversation, and Jennifer touched my arm and said, "There's champagne at the bar. You should get some. Mingle. Meet Brandon's family. They're lovely." And then she drifted away toward a group of her sorority friends, who were clustered near the windows taking photos. I walked to the bar, feeling like I was moving through water, and ordered champagne from a bartender who smiled professionally without seeing me. And I took my glass and found a spot near one of the floral arrangements where I could observe without being obviously alone. And I sipped the champagne and did more breathing exercises and told myself I just had to get through the next few hours, and then I could leave and never do this again. I was standing there trying to look purposeful rather than abandoned, when I heard my mother's voice carrying from a nearby cluster of guests. That particular tone she used when she was sharing something sad but brave, and I heard her say, "Our youngest Sarah is here somewhere. She's been going through a difficult time, couldn't quite make it work in her field out in California, but we're hopeful she'll find her footing." And I felt the champagne turn sour in my mouth as I realized she was already rewriting my narrative for her audience, already diminishing me to make her world make sense. I was still standing near the floral arrangement holding my champagne and trying to decide whether to stay or leave when there was a commotion near the entrance, and I heard someone greeting the hosts with the kind of warm authority that makes people turn their heads. And I looked over to see a distinguished man in his early 60s wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit walking into the ballroom with a woman who I assumed was his wife, and Jennifer was rushing over to greet them with Brandon following close behind, looking nervous and eager to please. I didn't recognize them at first, but then I heard Brandon's voice carrying across the room saying, "Dad, Mom, I'm so glad you could make it." And I realized this was Robert Chen, Brandon's father. And something about his face was familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. I turned slightly away, not wanting to be noticed, and was contemplating moving to a different corner of the room when I heard a voice behind me say, "Sarah Mitchell?" And the tone was so genuinely surprised and pleased that I turned around reflexively, and Robert Chen was standing 3 feet away from me, with his hand extended and a broad smile on his face, and he said, "It is you! I didn't know you'd be here." And I took his hand automatically and said, "I'm sorry, have we met?" And he laughed and said, "No, but I just read about you in TechCrunch last week, the profile on emerging tech leaders, and then the announcement about the Tech Vision acquisition. Your work is remarkable." And I felt my face flush as I registered that Brandon's father had recognized me from a tech industry article, and I could see people nearby turning to look at us with curious expressions. Robert was still shaking my hand enthusiastically, and he said, "Your platform architecture was exactly what Tech Vision needed. I actually spoke with their CEO at a conference 2 weeks ago, and he wouldn't stop talking about how your team's work was the crown jewel of the acquisition." And his voice wasn't quiet. It carried across the immediate area with the confidence of someone used to being heard. And I saw my mother's head turn sharply in our direction from where she was standing 20 feet away. I managed to say, "Thank you. That's very kind." And Robert said, Kind nothing, it's accurate. The technical elegance of what you built is exactly the kind of innovation our industry needs. And then he turned and called over to where Brandon and Jennifer were standing, looking confused, and he said, "Brandon, you didn't tell me your fiancé's sister was Sarah Mitchell." And I watched my sister's face contort with confusion as she walked over with Brandon, and she said, "You know Sarah?" Like the concept made no sense. And Robert said, "Well, not personally until now, but everyone in tech knows about her work. The acquisition was all over the news. She's one of TechCrunch's 30 under 30." And he turned back to me and said, "Your parents must be incredibly proud." And in that moment, I saw my mother approaching with my father close behind, and their faces were blank masks of confusion, trying to reorganize themselves into something appropriate. And the silence that followed Robert's statement stretched out for what felt like hours, as everyone waited for someone to explain how this moment made sense. My mother materialized at my elbow within seconds of that stretched-out silence, and her face had reorganized itself into what I recognized as her charity gala smile, the one she used when she needed to appear gracious under pressure. And she said, "Sarah, you didn't tell us you knew the Chens," with a light laugh that sounded like breaking glass. And I looked at her directly for the first time since I'd arrived and said, "I don't know them, we just met." And Robert Chen jumped in with the easy enthusiasm of someone who had no idea he was detonating a bomb and said, "I'm just a fan of her work. The acquisition of DataStream by TechVision was brilliantly executed. Sarah's platform architecture was valued at over $50 million as the primary asset." And I watched my father's face go completely blank as he processed that number, and my mother's smile froze in place, while her eyes darted between Robert and me, trying to calculate how to respond. Jennifer was staring at me like I'd just appeared out of thin air, and she said, "What acquisition?" And Brandon, who had been quiet, suddenly looked at me with new attention and said, "Wait, you're the Sarah Mitchell from the TechCrunch article? The one Dad was talking about at dinner last week?" And Robert nodded enthusiastically and said, "The very same. She's director of engineering at DataStream, or I suppose now at TechVision after the acquisition went through. Her team built the customer analytics platform that every major company has been trying to replicate for 3 years." And he turned to my parents and said, "You must have been following the news coverage. It was quite significant. The stock options alone for senior team members were reported to be worth well over $1 million." My father stepped forward then with his hand extended toward me like we were meeting for the first time, and he said, "Sarah, I didn't realize you'd moved into such a senior position." And his voice had that heartiness he used with business associates. And I shook his hand because refusing would have made a scene, but I didn't smile, and I said, "I was promoted to senior engineering manager 14 months ago and then to director 3 weeks ago." And my mother said, "You never told us," with something that was supposed to sound like hurt feelings, but came out more like accusation. And I looked at her directly and said, "I tried to tell you at dinner in June when Jennifer announced her engagement, but you said I was making everything about myself." And the words came out calm and factual, and I watched her face flush. Robert Chen was looking between us now with growing confusion, like he was starting to sense he'd walked into something complicated. And Jennifer said, "Sarah works in computers," with that same dismissive tone she'd always used. And Brandon said, "Jen, she's a director of engineering at a company that just got acquired for $200 million. That's not just working in computers." And there was something in his voice that might have been respect or might have been recalculation. And I saw Jennifer's expression shift from confusion to something harder. My father was still processing, and he said, "DataStream, I've heard of that company. Johnson from the club was just talking about their platform last month." And Robert said, "I'm not surprised, they're industry leaders, and Sarah's been there for 6 years building it from the ground up." And my mother touched my arm with her hand and said, "We should catch up properly, Sarah. I want to hear all about this." And her touch felt like ownership, like she was already rewriting the narrative in real time to make this fit her version of our family. I watched my mother's hand on my arm, and the way she was already turning toward Robert Chen to say something that would reframe this entire conversation, But before she could speak, a woman in her 50s wearing sapphire blue approached our group and said, "Excuse me, are you Sarah Mitchell?" And I nodded, and she extended her hand and said, "I'm Catherine Winters. I work with your father at the firm. I just have to say, I read the profile about you in TechCrunch, and it was so impressive. We were all talking about it in the office." And she turned to my father and said, "David, you must be bursting with pride. Your daughter's accomplishments are remarkable." And my father's smile looked like it had been carved into his face, and he said, "Yes, of course, we've been following her career closely," which was such a blatant lie that I almost laughed. And then another voice joined in, a man I didn't recognize saying, "Sarah Mitchell, the data stream director? My company just signed a contract to use your platform. It's incredible what you've built." And suddenly there were 4 or 5 people gathered around, and my mother's face was cycling through expressions too quickly to control, and I could see her recalculating everything in real time. Jennifer had gone very still beside Brandon, and her champagne glass was gripped so tightly in her hand that I thought it might shatter, and Brandon was looking at his phone, and then at me, and then at his phone again, like he was cross-referencing something, and then he said quietly, "Jen, did you know about any of this?" And Jennifer said, "She works in computers." But her voice had lost all its certainty, and one of the women in the growing circle said, "She's a director of engineering at one of the most successful tech companies in the Bay Area. That's extraordinary." And my father was nodding along like he'd known all along and saying, "Sarah's always been brilliant with technology," which was grotesque because he'd never once asked me about my work in 6 years. Robert Chen was still standing there looking increasingly uncomfortable as he began to understand that something was very wrong with this family dynamic. And his wife had joined us, and she was looking at my mother with an expression I couldn't quite read, but it wasn't friendly. And I heard her say quietly to Robert, "I thought you said they were a close family." And Robert said nothing, but his face had tightened. More people were approaching now, drawn by the commotion, and the mention of the TechCrunch article and the acquisition, and I heard fragments of conversation around me, people saying $200 million acquisition, and $50 million platform, and stock options, and 30 under 30, and every word felt like it was stripping away the narrative my family had built about who I was. And my mother's smile had become desperate, and she said loudly, "We're just so proud of both our daughters," gesturing to Jennifer and me like we were equivalent accomplishments. And I saw Jennifer's face flash with anger because even now, even in this moment, she couldn't stand to share the spotlight. Catherine Winters was talking to my father saying, "You never mentioned Sarah was leading the data stream engineering team, David. That's the kind of thing you should be shouting from the rooftops." And my father said, "Well, we didn't want her to feel pressured by our expectations." And the revisionist history was happening in real time right in front of me. And I felt something hard and cold settling in my chest, because I realized they were going to do this. They were going to pretend they'd supported me all along, pretend the letter never happened, pretend I hadn't spent 28 years begging for scraps of their attention. I heard my father launch into another anecdote about how he'd always known I was destined for great things, and something inside me that had been bending for 28 years finally snapped. And I said, "I need to speak with you privately." And my voice cut through the conversation clearly enough that several people stopped talking. And my mother's eyes widened, and she said, "Sarah, this isn't the time." But I said, "Now," and turned toward the hallway that led to the private rooms off the main ballroom. And I didn't wait to see if they would follow because I knew they would. They couldn't risk me saying whatever I was about to say in front of their audience. I walked into a small sitting room done in cream and gold, and I stood by the window overlooking the golf course, and I heard them file in behind me. My mother first saying, "Sarah, what is this about? You're making a scene." And my father saying, "We're in the middle of your sister's engagement party." And Jennifer saying nothing. But I could feel her presence in the doorway. And I turned to face all three of them, and I pulled out my phone, and I opened my email, and I found the message from 2 months ago, and I said, "I want to read you something." And my mother said, "Sarah, please, can we do this another time?" And I said, "No." And I started reading aloud. "Dear Sarah, After much discussion, your father, Jennifer, and I have agreed that you are no longer part of this family. And my mother's face went white, and she said, I never, but I kept reading. Your constant need for attention and your inability to be happy for your sister's successes has become too much to bear. And Jennifer made a small sound. But I didn't look at her. I kept reading every single word of that letter. We are uninviting you from Jennifer's engagement party and any future family gatherings until you can learn to be supportive instead of making everything about yourself. And when I finished the last line, perhaps some time away will help you reflect on your behavior. The room was completely silent. My father said, I don't remember that letter. And I looked at him and said, it came from Mom's email address. It referenced conversations between the three of you, and nobody contacted me afterward to say it was sent in error. And my mother had tears running down her face, and she said, I was upset. You were so negative at that dinner. You were trying to steal Jennifer's moment. And I said, I tried to share that I'd been promoted to senior engineering manager, and you told me I was making everything about myself. Those were your exact words. And my voice was still calm, but my hands were shaking. I said, do you want to know why you didn't know about my career, about the acquisition, about any of it? And I didn't wait for them to answer. I said, because every single time I tried to share anything with you for 6 years, you dismissed it. You changed the subject. You made it clear that nothing I did mattered unless it was supporting Jennifer. And I started listing specific instances. When I got my first promotion, you asked if it came with better health insurance. When I told you I was leading a team of 12 engineers, Dad said that's nice and went back to reading the newspaper. When I mentioned my salary had doubled, Mom said money isn't everything and asked if I was dating anyone. And each example landed like a stone, and I watched their faces trying to reorganize around this new information. My father said, why didn't you tell us how successful you were becoming? And I almost laughed and I said, I just told you why, because you never cared enough to listen. And Jennifer finally spoke and she said, you always acted like you were better than us. And her voice was small and defensive, and I looked at her directly and I said, I acted like I wanted to be seen. And something in her face cracked just slightly. I looked at Jennifer, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Something vulnerable and real, and I said, I didn't come here for revenge. And my voice was steady and clear. I didn't orchestrate what happened out there. I didn't plan for Robert Chen to recognize me, or for your future father-in-law to publicly praise my work. I just existed, and the truth came out. And I looked at each of them in turn. My mother with mascara running down her cheeks. My father with his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was trying to control his anger. Jennifer with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I said, I came here tonight because despite everything, despite that letter, I wanted to celebrate Jennifer's engagement. And Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, and I said, I was genuinely happy for you at that dinner, 3 weeks before the letter. I wanted to share in your joy. But you couldn't let me have even a moment of my own happiness. And my mother started to say something, but I held up my hand and said, I'm not finished. I said, for 28 years I have made myself smaller, so you could feel bigger. I have downplayed my achievements so you wouldn't feel threatened. I have apologized for existing in ways that inconvenienced your narrative about this family. And my father said, that's not fair. And I said, what's not fair is that you paid $60,000 for Jennifer's private university education, and I took out student loans that I only finished paying off last year. What's not fair is that you threw Jennifer a graduation party with 100 guests and took me to dinner at Olive Garden. What's not fair is that I have been begging for your attention for my entire life, and the only time you noticed me was when other people made you see me. And my voice cracked on that last part, but I kept going. I said, I'm not asking you to change. I'm not asking you to suddenly become the parents I needed. I'm telling you that I won't minimize myself for your comfort anymore. And my mother said, we love you. And it sounded desperate, and I said, maybe you do, but you've never liked me, and there's a difference. and that landed hard enough that she actually took a step back. Jennifer said quietly, "I was jealous of you." And it was so unexpected that I turned to look at her fully, and she said, "You were always so smart, so independent. You didn't need anyone, and I hated that about you." And I said, "I needed you, all of you. I just stopped showing it because it hurt too much." And we looked at each other, and I saw her really seeing me maybe for the first time. My father said, "What do you want from us?" And I said, "I want you to acknowledge what happened. I want you to admit that the letter was real and cruel, and that it was the culmination of years of making me feel worthless." And he said nothing. But my mother said, "I was angry. I thought you were trying to ruin Jennifer's moment." And I said, "I was trying to exist." And she didn't have an answer for that. I said, "If you want any kind of relationship with me going forward, it will be on my terms. It will require honesty. It will require you to acknowledge me as a whole person, not just as Jennifer's supporting character, and it will require respect." And I looked at my mother and said, "If you can't do that, then the letter already told me everything I need to know. I'm not part of this family, and I'll stop pretending otherwise." And the silence that followed felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I left them standing in that cream and gold room, and I walked back out into the party, and I could feel their eyes on my back. But I didn't turn around, and the celebration was winding down with guests beginning to gather their things and say their goodbyes, and I found my clutch where I'd left it at the table, and I pulled out my phone to text Maya that I was ready to leave. Jennifer found me by the coat check, and she said, "Sarah, wait." And her voice was different than it had been in that room, quieter and less certain. And I turned to face her, and she said, "I don't know how to do this." And I said, "Do what?" And she said, "Be your sister in a way that's real." And I felt something shift in my chest because it was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I said, "I don't know either, but we can't build anything on pretending." And she nodded, and her eyes were red, and she said, "I'm sorry for the letter. I knew Mom was sending it, and I didn't stop her. I told myself you deserved it, because you were always so much better at everything than me." And I said, "That's not true." And she said, "You don't need anyone. You never did. And I've always needed everyone." And I understood then that she'd been just as trapped in our family dynamic as I had been, just in a different way. I said, "I did need you, all of you. I just learned to stop showing it." And she said, "Can we try to be real?" And I said, "Maybe, but it has to be actually real, not just when it's convenient." And she nodded and said, "I'll try." And I said, "That's all I can ask." And we stood there awkwardly for a moment before she stepped forward and hugged me, and it was stiff and uncertain, but it was something. My father appeared then, and he said, "Sarah, we should talk about this more." And I said, "Not tonight." And he said, "When?" And I said, "When I'm ready, if I'm ready." And I could see him struggling with not being in control of the situation, but he nodded and said, "Your mother is very upset." And I said, "I imagine she is." And I didn't offer to fix it, and his face registered surprise at that. My mother stayed wherever she'd gone after our conversation in the private room, and I was grateful not to have to see her because I didn't have anything left to give. And Maya texted that she was outside, and I said goodbye to Jennifer and told her congratulations again, and I meant it. And I walked out of that country club into the cool evening air, and I saw Maya's car, and I got in, and she looked at my face and said, "How bad?" And I said, "I told them everything." And she said, "Good." And she drove, and I watched the lights of the city pass by the window. We didn't talk much on the drive back to San Francisco and Maya's apartment in the Mission where I was staying the night, because I hadn't wanted to risk running into my family at a hotel. And when we got inside, she poured us both wine, and we sat on her couch, and I told her everything that had happened in that room, every word I'd said and every reaction I'd witnessed. And she listened, and when I was done, she said, "I'm proud of you." And I started crying then, really crying, because I'd been holding it together all night, and I didn't have to anymore. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my office in downtown San Francisco with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, and the letter is framed on my wall, not hidden away in a drawer, but displayed where I can see it every day. And people who visit ask about it sometimes, and I tell them it's a reminder of the day I stopped seeking approval from people who were never going to give it. I talk to Jennifer once every few weeks now, and sometimes it's awkward, and sometimes it's almost easy, and we're learning how to be honest with each other even when it's uncomfortable. And I had dinner with my parents once about 3 months ago, and it was stilted and strange, and my mother cried, and my father talked too much, and I left after 90 minutes because that was all I could manage. And I don't know if we'll ever have a real relationship, but I know I don't need one to be whole. My career has continued to flourish, and I'm now director of engineering, and I mentor young women in tech, and I tell them that their worth isn't determined by who celebrates them, and I've built a family of choice with Maya and my colleagues and friends who see me for who I actually am. And some days I still feel that old ache of wanting my parents to be proud of me, but it gets quieter every time. I look at that framed letter sometimes, and I remember the girl who read it with shaking hands and thought she was being erased, and I see how far I've come from that moment. And I understand now that they didn't erase me by writing those words. They freed me from the need to keep trying to make them see what was always there. I didn't need them to see my worth. I just needed to see it myself. And now I do, and that changes everything.